Okay, welcome to our next lecture in the Cold War unit. Today we're going to be talking about the Korean War, but before we get to the Korean War, we have a few things to talk about in terms of how the Cold War was affecting the United States at home. And what we start to see is with people that had been our allies during World War II, people that had fought against our enemies all over the world are turning communist. You have the Soviet Union that is swallowing up all of Eastern Europe and turning those into satellite countries. You have China that Mao Zedong is kicking out the nationalists, sending them off to Taiwan, and converting the rest of China to a communist dictatorship. That fear is spreading across the United States at home, and the people believed that communists may try to actually overthrow the American government and change the United States into a communist country. And that created all sorts of adverse effects at home. One of those was an employee loyalty program that the government created in 1947 that was almost completely ineffective. Didn't have hardly anything to do with most people, but it just was a way that it showed the American people that even the government was very concerned about that, and it added to the culture of fear that was pervasive in the United States at that time. We also have the creation of HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. This was also very well known in the late 40s and 50s. Their job was basically to conduct a witch hunt for communists in the government first, and then spread it, of course, to the entertainment industry. And one sort of important and well-known group from that was the Hollywood 10. They were people from the entertainment industry that actually stood up to HUAC, stood up to this culture of fear, and because they refused to answer questions, they were tossed in prison. You start to see the creation of blacklists. If they even suspected that people, specifically actors and musicians, had anything to do with communism or any sympathies for communism, they were put on lists that were circulated to the heads of companies and studios, and these people were not hired because of their political beliefs. I'm going to go ahead and switch to the next slide. This also culminated, I think, in the top headline stories would have been accusations of people spying for the communists within our own government. One of those would have been Mr. Alger Hiss. He was accused of passing information to the Soviets, and it was a very difficult trial for the prosecution. The first one ended in a mistrial. They were not able to convict him, and eventually he was thrown into prison. He was convicted of spying, and they gave him a 10-year sentence, of which he served 3.5 years. But it was very controversial because it took them so long and so many different trials to convict him, and he maintained his innocence up until his death about 10 or 15 years ago. He insisted that everything had been fabricated against him and that he had been a scapegoat for people that were just looking to find communists and put them away in prison. Even more famous than Alger Hiss, though, would have been Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Very, very well-known trial, very much in the headlines for years and years and years. These people were accused of passing information about nuclear weapons to the Soviet Union. They were accused of this, and they were eventually convicted, and because they were convicted of treason against the United States, they were actually executed. They were convicted and they were put to death by the electric chair. And this was hugely controversial, even more so than Alger Hiss, because he was just put in jail for a few years, which, while that's pretty bad, he wasn't actually killed by the government, and these people were. They have they had small children that were orphaned by them being executed. There have been books and stories and all sorts of things written about them over the years. There's still controversy about whether or not they actually were guilty, and so that's just goes to show you that even in the face of some doubt, the government was so concerned about communist influence in this time period that they were willing to execute two civilians. The very first time civilians had ever been executed for treason in the United States was Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. That's going to be the end of part one. We will actually move into the Korean War itself in part two.